Caesar is the first S-rank defense unit, and you all probably already know that she's good, but she has even more hidden potential that you may not know about. In this video, I will give you 5 tips to take Caesar from just another character to the strongest character on your account. I'll cover everything you need to know from the basics to advanced tricks that I haven't seen anyone else talk about. I'll also provide some tips to play her better to increase your team's DPS. Finally, I'll also give tips for specific teams for how she pairs with other characters and explain the pros and cons of using her in specific teams in case you're still on the fence about getting her. As a defense unit, let's explain her role on the team. There are 3 types of attacks enemies can do: light attacks, heavy attacks, and attacks only ranged characters can dodge. Defense units are special in that, for the first 2, they only consume 1 parry charge, and provide useful effects for the defensive assist. In Caesar's case, you get the shield and it gives you up to 1000 attack depending on the level of her core passive, so most of her gameplay is just parry to her. Of course there's more to her kit, but that's the most important part of understanding how defense units fit into your team. If you're a mobile player, you want to make sure she's after the character that spends most of the time on field, since Hoyo hasn't let mobile players swap backwards yet. This also means you want someone on field most of the time to parry to Caesar from, but I'll talk about that more later. She does have more to her kit than just a parry, so let's talk about that. Her skill is the other important part to her kit. She pretty much has 2 skills, consider them part 1 and part 2. Both of them are counterattacks, and after a defensive assist, she can skip straight to part 2. And parries, blocks, and enhanced basics, which I'll talk about later, apply her additional ability. Does this mean her gameplay is just parry and block? Well, there's more. Remember how I said there are 3 types of attacks? You can actually do something about those third types of attacks that only ranged characters can dodge. When you swap when it's a red flash, you will enter with a quick assist. Some attacks take long enough that you can swap and then block with that exact same attack. Again, this is only for the longer attacks. In a lot of cases, the attack is finished before you actually get the counterattack. Let's take it a step further. If you have a range attack, parrying these attacks will always swap to the ranged character to trigger the time slow. Time slow. I just mentioned needing time to trigger the counterattack after a swap, so this time slow should give us that time, right? Exactly. Against certain attacks, you can swap to your ranged character with the parry, get that defensive assist, and then still have enough time to swap to Caesar and counterattack. Finally, for swapping off Caesar, just like how you can dodge, counter, and parry at the same time, with Caesar you can block and parry at the same time, and this works with both parts of her counterattack. Let's talk about the rest of her kit real quick. Her basic attacks aren't noteworthy, and I'll go so far as to say that if you're basic attacking with Caesar, there's probably a better way to play out the situation. Same with her dodge counter. There's little reason to actually use that when you can just counter and block with her skill. Her chain attacks refresh the shield, but it does not apply the debuff from her addition ability, so be mindful of that. And until they give agents their own decibels, we probably aren't touching her ult. Finally, her enhanced basic does have uses. It's kinda cool for grouping, but the difference between her and Nicole is that Nicole's field lasts for a few seconds and keeps enemies there. So unless you stun everyone immediately, after pulling everyone in with this attack, they usually just disperse and the grouping ends up not mattering. You also shouldn't totally ignore this enhanced basic against bosses. For example, the bulldozers in particular attack very slowly, so you won't be able to use many parry charges, and in that case you can expend parry charges for this enhanced basic for the debuff. Also, if the buff is about to expire or the boss doesn't have it and you're about to daze it, it's a good idea to use the enhanced basic to debuff it, because obviously you cannot parry or perfect block while the boss is dazed. Alright, for my next tip, it will be that not every attack has to be parried or blocked by Caesar. You generate a lot of daze for landing these blocks and defensive assists, so why wouldn't you want to? The first example will be for anomalies. In case you aren't aware, as soon as you swap off a character, they can no longer proc anomalies or actually kill anything. They would just be left with 1 HP, or a full anomaly bar. We could want to save the anomaly, but most times we don't want to. In those latter cases, we'd rather just use the shield and take damage while finishing the anomaly. The second time we wouldn't want to parry is when it interrupts a damage combo. For most characters in the game, the majority of their basic attack damage comes from the final hits in the attack string. Ellen is a very good example. With her flash freeze charges, the majority of the damage comes from that third hit. We'd rather not swap off of her before getting that third hit if we can avoid it. Chingy is another example. She's very greedy with field time, so we want to make sure we fill up her bar until it's at least yellow before we swap. Now this isn't always true, because let's say your parry will daze the enemy, you should probably just go for it. This is something to just consider, so don't consider a definite rule to never swap off of before Ellen's basic deck 3 or Chingy's bar becomes yellow, etc. Finally, this one sounds obvious, but it's also still worth mentioning. You might just want a dodge counter instead. You could be playing Nekomata, who depends on it for a core passive, or maybe your attacker is using the Starlight engine and needs to dodge counter for that juicy attack buff, or it could just be beneficial to dodge counter in the case of Zhu Yuan, who likes dodge countering for bullets. Caesar is a pretty simple character at its core, but she's also one of the most flexible. So my next tip will be to pair her with the right teammates. Okay, almost every character in the game can be your teammate reasonably well because their additional ability works with literally every melee character in the game, but there are some pairings that work better than others, and just because Caesar is good in one of your team slot doesn't necessarily mean that she's the best in the slot. I'll explain some more specific details about how Caesar feels to play with certain characters and whether or not it's better than already existing options. Now let's talk about Zhu Yuan. I think it's pretty well accepted that she's got one team. Zhu Yuan, Nicole, and a stunner, preferably Chingy, but if you don't have her, everyone else mostly functions the same, just being a generic stunner to fill the enemy's daze bar. Let's talk about replacing the stunner first. So our team would be Zhu Yuan, Caesar, and Nicole. You're trading a faster stun and shorter stun cycles and more daze multiplier in the case of Chingy for Caesar's buffs and defenses. I've shown already, but Caesar's on-field daze is not very good. With this team, you're going to spend most of the time on Zhu Yuan. You want to make sure you're doing your assault combos correctly, even though it's not too important if you mess them up. Zhu Yuan really appreciates the anti-interruption resistance, especially in her suppressive mode when she's firing her bullets, because it's really annoying to get interrupted during that. In her assault mode combos, it's a little less important because Zhu Yuan likes doing dodge counters to generate more bullets, but it's still nice to have the anti-interruption resistance. Chingy's daze multiplier during the stun window is stronger than the buffs that Caesar gives, however those are only up during the daze multiplier, so because of the overall uptime of Caesar's buffs, the damage bonus that Zhu Yuan gets is actually pretty similar. So obviously this is a good team. Now let's talk about replacing Nicole with Chingy, in case you want to do that. So right off the bat I have to approach this first wave differently because I don't have Nicole to basically group everything for me. The best case scenario, it wasn't too bad. It was only 4 seconds slower, but on average, it was upwards of like 10 seconds slower than having Nicole. Something that's important to note is that even though we do want to parry with Caesar whenever possible, just because we see the yellow flash for a parry doesn't mean it's going to be Caesar, because certain attacks can only be counterattacked by Zhu Yuan. Now let's talk about disadvantages. The lack of quick assists means that Zhu Yuan loses one source of bullets, even if he didn't get that many bullets from quick assists, they were still useful to have. Additionally, we have 3 characters, all different elements, and none of them apply anomalies fast, so you generally won't be applying many anomalies throughout a fight. And especially in the case of Zhu Yuan, she really wants to be able to proc corruption for her Chaos Metal Disc Drive set, which actually gives her a lot of damage. I will say though, the one big advantage is that you only need to do Zhu Yuan's chain attack in general, so that gives you more time to take advantage of Chingy's daze multiplier, but because of the lack of ether anomaly buildup, Zhu Yuan generally does more damage having the hole on her team. So since I spent most of this section talking about disadvantages, I think it's pretty obvious this is not my favorite team. I would personally rate these teams with the original Zhu Yuan team being the best, followed by replacing the stunner, then replacing Nicole, and then finally having just a regular stunner. That doesn't mean the other 2 options are bad. For example, if Hoyo creates a mode where the stun durations are really short, then Chingy loses value and Caesar just slots into her spot perfectly. So against tougher and more aggressive enemies, Caesar and Chingy is a good pairing so that you can stun the enemy as fast as possible and have less time that they can try to hit you. I think I've shown that Caesar fits well enough with Zhu Yuan that having a normal stunner is generally just a less effective option than having Caesar on your team. I'm going to assume you want to play Caesar, so there's little reason to run the generic stunner comp when Caesar fits in that slot very well. That being said, she's very good for Zhu Yuan, but definitely not a must pull. Okay, now let's talk about Piper. This section will be much shorter because I don't have Lucy or Grace, 2 of Piper's most common 2 other teammates, built on this account, so I can't talk about them. Caesar offers Piper the protection that she really likes because she generally face tanks stuff while spinning in the opponent's face. However, she doesn't benefit from the shield as much as other characters because her spin already gives her enough anti-interruption resistance. Now they're both physical, and in practice this actually doesn't matter because technically Caesar should be able to proc anomalies while Piper is off field. This isn't a problem if you just swap to Caesar in basic attack and activate the anomaly before she lands with her leap, but when she's spinning and you parry, you will generally waste a lot of anomaly buildup because the parry animation takes a long time, so the anomaly won't be activated until that finishes. Lucy is definitely the best option for slot 3, even though Nicole performs fine. I would not recommend Seth because you lose out on his additional ability where he gives the anomaly buildup res reduction. And finally, I think it's worth mentioning that I think the faction Vengvu for the Sons of Caledon is awesome, so if you're a Piper enthusiast, I definitely would recommend getting Caesar to amplify this team. If you're wondering about pairing Piper with Nekomata, I'll talk about that later in the video. And as for how Bernice fits in with these two, I'll just wait until Bernice comes out to make that judgment. Now let's talk about Caesar and Ellen teams. I'm using the Shield defense for B-roll, but just be aware that this Shield defense buffs by Caesar by a lot, so comparing Ellen Caesar teams to the Mono Ice team is pretty unfair, at least for this stage. So just keep that in mind. Ellen's best team right now is herself, Lycon, and Sokaku. Sokaku is free, but if you don't have Lycon, you actually have a lot of options from supports to stunners, but now we have Caesar, so let's talk about replacing him first. Ellen's biggest weaknesses is that the majority of her damage comes from her basic attack 3, which requires you to basic attack 3 times and hold it for the maximum damage. Even dodge counters don't feel good because you lose that progress towards the basic attack 3. So whenever an enemy attacks you, either you dodge counter and lose your progress towards that basic attack 3, which is where all your damage is, get knocked down and lose damage regardless, or use your X skill, which feels the least bad, but you still are losing flash freeze charges and progress towards that basic attack 3. Caesar's shield gives that interruption resistance that you really actually need, so Ellen gets to go nuts on field with her flash freeze charges much more easily. Obviously, their offensive buffs are different, but the big difference is that Caesar is a reactive stunner while Lycon is proactive, so if an enemy doesn't give you many counterattack or parry opportunities, Lycon will definitely stun the enemy much faster. You also get the benefit of not having to waste some time during the day's multiplier, chain attacking onto Lycon if you then start the chain attack with him to get that extra day's multiplier from Lycon. Finally, Sokaku generally face tanks the enemy when she uses her skill, and Caesar's shield helps protect her, but you do get diminishing returns with the attack bonuses. For most of the hard content in the game, you'll have other attack bonuses, so that can lead to this combination not outperforming other options damage-wise because of diminishing returns on the attack bonus. Even still, Caesar is a great replacement for Lycon, or the stunner position. But what about Sokaku? Frankly, there's little reason to not use Sokaku because she's free, and the only benefit her dupes gives her is from her N4. But let's talk about replacing her. Comparing the buffs, they're actually very similar. 1000 attack, and Sokaku gives 20% ice damage and 10% ice res reduction with her M4 and up to 8% attack with her W engine, while Caesar gives 25% damage ramp. Something also worth noting is that Caesar's buffs apply to everyone, so even your Lycon can start doing decent damage if he's high enough level. Caesar's buffs also generally have a higher uptime than Sokaku. Sokaku also spends a lot of time on field herself in order to create the attack buff, getting those 3 stacks. And also not just that, but when I play her, I usually use the chain attack to pass the buff, and that wastes a lot of time on the day's multiplier. Caesar doesn't need to chain attack, so this is a massive bonus. So in my opinion, this is Ellen's best team. It could just be that I'm a massive Sokaku hater, but that doesn't mean that the Mono Ice team is now bad. The one advantage it does have is in applying anomalies, because Caesar generally won't apply enough anomaly to even proc 1 assault herself in a single fight. So with the Mono Ice team, you'll generally apply more ice anomalies. One example where this matters is the Razor boss, where he self-shocks himself and you want to proc disorders in order to apply more days to him. Now he's resistant to ice, but they probably will reuse this mechanic sometime in the future for a different boss, so when that comes, you'll probably want the Mono Ice team for the most anomalies. So to summarize, I think Ellen, Lycon, and Caesar is Ellen's new best team, and if you don't have Lycon, then Ellen, Caesar, and Sokaku is also a very good team. Even if Caesar is not one of the highest damage team compositions, I think the quality of life that she brings with Ellen being able to fully get to her basic deck 3 uninterrupted is too good to not consider. Finally, let's talk about the last DPS I have built on this account, which is Nekomata. I'll keep it brief because I'll be repeating myself a lot here if I fully expand on all of my points, but pretty much Nekomata benefits from having a physical buffer, but it's not like Caesar makes Nekomata S plus tier, or that they have any special synergy greater than what other characters have. I personally found Nekomata Caesar Nicole to be stronger than Nekomata Caesar Qingyi, mostly because a million is actually really strong as a Bangbu, and it's easier to activate Nekomata's core passive with the support. Also, I found the non-physical team with Nekomata, Piper, and Caesar to be decent, but I ran into the same problem where the lack of quick assist means that it's possible for Nekomata to not have her core passive up at some times, which makes her lose a lot of damage. It's also a little harder to play because you also have to manage Piper's power buff and make sure that it's up for chain attacks, and you also have 3 people who do want field time at some point, but if you can manage this, it's still a perfectly viable team. Okay, now for the rest of the DPS, I'll talk about the DPS I've built on my other accounts so I can tell you how I think they play with Caesar, but I can't give a definitive experience actually playing them with Caesar. First off, Corinne. Her team is herself, Lycon, and a support, or herself, Stunner, and Rina. If you are running the former, Caesar is excellent to replace the support, but if you're running the latter, I don't think Caesar is that great because Corinne really hates being on field without the enemy stun, so Caesar doesn't have someone else to play off of. Next, Soldier 11. If you're running Caesar, you're either running Soldier 11, Caesar and Lucy, or Soldier 11, Kaleda and Caesar. Both will play well, but I think the former is better since Soldier 11 likes being on field more, but I don't own Kaleda, so don't take my word definitively for that. Next, Jane Doe. One of her teammates is pretty locked into being Seth, and Caesar fits nicely into the 3rd slot. However, before you get Caesar to finish the team, I'd advise against it even if it's her best team. Bernice is right around the corner, who I think will be better than Caesar in that 3rd slot, and both parries want to parry to get off their buffs, so you could end up running into a situation where they fight over parries, but most content isn't hard enough for that to be a problem. So if you have Caesar, you definitely should use her as a 3rd teammate for Jane Doe, but don't get Caesar just for the purpose of completing your Jane Doe team. Finally, when it comes to Billy and Anton, I haven't played them, and for Grace, I also haven't played her, but just be aware that don't play Caesar with Grace and Rina. This is probably the only pairing of 2 characters that you'd realistically use that you cannot slot Caesar in as the 3rd member because you won't be able to activate her additional ability. Finally, for my last tip, it's that she gets better the more you know the enemies. Yeah, Zelda Zone Zero isn't so difficult that you need to study your enemies' moves and patterns, but just by facing enemies a bunch, you'll get to intuitively learn their attack patterns and stuff, so you know when to parry and what to parry. Landing perfect blocks, especially with the sound effect, is extremely satisfying, while missing perfect blocks can also make you feel like a noob. Caesar is an extremely flexible character who's very fun to play and also has some fun tricks that she can pull off. Right now she's probably the closest the game has gone to a must pull, but I will never say that anyone is. But that's just because the amount of quality life and flexibility that she has gives so much value, and hopefully I've given you some useful tips and convinced you that she's the best character in the game right now. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Hopefully I don't lose my Bernice 50-50, and I can get that Bernice video out sooner than I did this one.